Blue Stool number 54, Sarah Camille Wilson.
So I'm here to tell you a story about this pot. This is the first pot that I bought that was made by a professional potter. I bought it in 2005 when I was in undergraduate school in Portland, Maine. It cost about $40, which was a lot of money for me at the time, but a classmate said, it will be worth it. You will treasure this, you will learn from this, this is an investment, you should do it. I listened, and she was right. It is a stoneware tea bowl. It has kind of a roughly cut foot and a lot of little areas of texture that make it so that it's really wonderful to hold in your hand, kind of however you hold it. I have kind of small hands and it fits nicely in my hands so that I can drink out of it. I like to drink coffee or tea out of it. It's made by an American potter named Warren McKenzie, who passed away a few years ago. He was still making pots right until he died. And he's really one of the legends of American studio ceramics. He was kind of the beginning of and the continuation of a tradition that is often referred to as the Mingei soda tradition. It is absolutely cultural appropriation. These were potters who were either educated in or settled in Minnesota, and they were very taken with the Japanese notion of mingei, which is sort of roughly translated to the art of the people that dates from the 1920s. And McKenzie was sort of the American proselytizer of this concept, which was popularized in the West by a man named Bernard Leach in England. And he learned most of what he sort of brought to the West from a Japanese potter named Hamada. So these are all sort of these legends of studio ceramics. And this sort of Mingei soda tradition is summed up in this notion that a good handmade pot is cheap, usable, and imbued with the human spirit. And that's something that was said by Sandy Simon, who was one of Mackenzie's students. It's a very romantic notion. It's kind of a reductive notion in a lot of different ways. And it's an idealistic concept as well. As a 19-year-old, I went all in for this idea. I was going to make humble pots. They were going to be for everybody, could be in every kitchen. I was going to make my living 100% from making these humble pots that were going to look like this, I thought, someday. Haven't gotten there yet. But I was just really, I was absolutely 100% full of the belief that handmade objects, they were humble, they were pure, they were just better. And then, of course, because I was 19, about 2 years later, I changed my mind and I spurned all of those notions. I said, this is elitist. These are humble pots that are supposed to be cheap, but I knew from my own experience buying this pot that wasn't actually true in the sense of it being something that everyone could buy. And I also started to think that this sort of rustic aesthetics were really outdated. Those were so 1970. I wasn't interested anymore. So the work that I made in the latter part of my undergraduate was very different from this. I was using porcelain. I wanted everything to be sleek. And I was like, oh, maybe it should look like it was made by a machine. I don't know. And then after I finished college, I apprenticed with a studio potter in southwestern Virginia named Sylvie Granatelli. And while I was working there, both through her and from all of the other potters in that general area, I was mentored by people who had been making their living from selling pots for many decades, much longer than I had been alive. And I learned during my 2.5 years there that what they were doing was not just about making objects, it was about making a life, and making a life through those objects that they were making with their hands. I learned a tremendous amount from Sylvie. She is one of probably the most significant mentor in my life. She taught me that ideas come from working. Every single day, no matter what, by 9 a.m., she was in the studio and she was working. She said, no matter what, you have to show up. You have to keep working. As long as you show up, the pots will come, as long as you're working. From there, I went to graduate school, and while I was in graduate school, I got research funding to go to Jingdezhen, China, which is the porcelain capital of the world. And the pots that are made there are mostly super refined, super delicate, beautiful porcelain. And I had this understanding that as the porcelain manufacturing capital of the world, this was going to be a place where the pots were made in a factory that was sort of sleek and was all going to be tools, and there'd be people there sort of watching the tools, but they would be, sort of hands off. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. That experience really changed my conception of what it means for an object to be handmade, because they are factory settings. Things are being made in multiples. It's very streamlined, but it's also extremely hands-on. And one of the things that really just totally changed my thinking about pots was that learning, as I did in the US, very much from the tradition that brought us this pot, you were supposed to throw the object and then trim the bottom only and never trim the inside. And every single one of those porcelain pots was trimmed outside and in, and the trimmer was considered more skilled than the thrower. The things I learned about pots, working with the porcelain there and watching the makers there, really changed my concept of the inside of a pot versus the outside of the pot. Something I always tell my students now is that you can't make on the outside of a pot what doesn't exist on the inside. That the inside of the pot is what makes the pot. It's easy to think when you're making it that the profile of the outside of the pot is what matters, because it's what you sort of see from a distance. But in terms of the true structure of the pot and also the function of the pot, it's what's on the inside that counts. The inside makes the pot. So now I teach ceramics. I teach community classes, and I also teach college students at CCV. And I've discovered, are really hungry for objects. They're really interested in pots, but basically all of their experience of pottery is mediated by the internet. They know names, they know websites, they know galleries. They have an idea of these objects as two-dimensional, but they've not really been exposed to them as physical objects. So I bring in pots from my collection, and they are far more interested in and engaged in that than they are in images that I show in PowerPoint presentations. So there's a sort of question, a question that I've been wrestling with since I was a 19-year-old buying this pot that I could barely afford in a gallery. Do we need handmade pots? In a purely utilitarian sense, I think the answer to that is no. We can buy any dish that we need produced by industry, although, as I learned on my trip to China, many of those factory-made ceramics are a lot more handmade than we're led to think. And those commercial pots have stories too. Having an object in your life, however it was made, imbues it with history and meaning. But if studying the construction and the history of objects has taught me anything, it's that objects are more than their function. They are more than the utility that can be served by something that's been produced in a factory. Objects connect us. This pot connects me to the person I was at 19. It connects me to the history that I have learned about this pot, the pots that came before it, the pots that came after it, the makers who came before it, the makers who came after us, after them, and who will come after me. An object that's been made by hand is a direct connection from the hand of the maker, the hand of Warren McKenzie, to the hand of the user, me. Objects tell stories. Many objects, like this one, will continue to tell those stories long after all of us are gone. That's why museums are full of pots from thousands of years ago. They last. And making is a life. In the words of Michael Simon, who was another student of Warren McKenzie's, being a maker is not just about any one pot. No one pot can sum up that life and all of the ideas that go into making and all of the ideas that come from use. Can we be creative without objects? Of course. But I also know that making with our hands is not the result of creativity. It's the source of it. Ideas come from making. You don't have to be creative to make. The act of making is what makes us creative.